So there's this guy standing at the edge of a crumbling dungeon floor, surrounded by monsters that could reduce most hunters to paste in about 3 seconds flat, and he's not even sweating. Not even a little. The monsters circle him like they've already won, like they're just splitting the dinner bill before they eat, and then this guy exhales, raises one hand, and the entire room just dies. Not figuratively. The dungeon boss, the elite mobs, the reinforcement waves, all of it, deleted in a flash that splits the darkness like a lightning bolt from a very annoyed god. But here's the thing that makes this insane. Just a few years ago, this same guy was failing basic hunter assessment, scraping the bottom of the rank ladder, getting looked down on by everyone in the industry, including, embarrassingly enough, his own family. A nobody, a C rank at best, stuck in a system that had already decided he didn't matter. So how does a guy like that end up standing in the middle of an obliterated dungeon with a mythic tier divine entity literally sitting in his soul? And why does he already know the names of every disaster that's coming before they even arrive? The answer involves a death, a regression, a deal with a goddess who barely tolerates him, and more mythic items than any one person was ever supposed to hold. Welcome to Mythic Item Obtained. The world didn't fall apart overnight. That's the part people always get wrong when they talk about the cataclysm. They picture it as one big dramatic moment, like a movie trailer where the sky cracks open and everyone looks up at the same time with their mouths hanging open. The reality was messier, slower, and somehow worse than that. 10 years ago, dimensional rifts started appearing across the globe. Not every country, not every city, just random spots, usually in densely populated areas, because the universe apparently decided mass panic was the aesthetic it was going for. These rifts opened up into what humanity eventually started calling dungeon pocket dimensions, packed wall to wall with monsters that had zero interest in peaceful coexistence. Some were small, some were enormous, all of them were dangerous. The response was exactly what you'd expect from a civilization that had never dealt with anything like this before. Chaos first, denial second, and then, eventually, adaptation. Because humans are weirdly good at adapting to nightmares once they realize the nightmares aren't going away. The ones who awakened abilities, and not everyone did, not by a long shot, became hunters. Ranked from F all the way up to the mythic level S rank and beyond. These were the people responsible for clearing dungeons before the rifts destabilized and the monsters inside spilled out into reality. It was dangerous work. People died constantly, but it was also lucrative, and it became one of the most prestigious career paths a person could choose. Korea, specifically, developed one of the most sophisticated hunter infrastructure systems in the world. Hunter guilds, ranking associations, training academies, all of it built on top of an industry that had only existed for a decade. The crown jewel of that system was Millennium Academy, Korea's top hunter school, the place that produced the majority of the country's high-ranking hunters and sent more talent to the global stage than any other institution on the peninsula. Getting into Millennium wasn't just impressive. For most hunters, it was the entire dream. Now cut to a guy who is absolutely, completely, categorically not living that dream. Min Jae-hyun is currently getting thrown through a dungeon wall, not metaphorically. A monster, something big, something with too many limbs and eyes that glow the wrong color, has just launched him across a C-rank dungeon like he's a piece of garbage being tossed into a bin. He hits the stone, slides, barely catches himself, and looks up through a busted lip and the kind of exhaustion that lives in your bones. He's 23 years old, C-rank hunter, 3 years out of what was supposed to be a promising career, and he's still grinding through mid-tier dungeons that most people his age cleared before they hit 20. His mana control is average, his physical output is average, his equipment is average. On paper, Min Jae-hyun is the human embodiment of the word fine, and he knows it. That's the part that stings the most. He knows exactly how mediocre he is, and he's been watching everyone around him climb past him for years. Old academy classmates who are now B-rank and A-rank hunters. His older brother, Min Seong-oh, who is somehow already rubbing shoulders with the upper tier of the hunter world at a frankly aggravating pace. His own guild, which has started giving him the kind of pitying looks that say more than any performance review ever could. He drags himself back to his feet, forces mana into his legs. The monster is coming back around. Jae-hyun exhales and raises his weapon. For all the wrong reasons, this is just another Tuesday. The dungeon run ends the way most of Jae-hyun's dungeon runs end, barely. He clears it, technically. The boss goes down after a fight that takes twice as long as it should and leaves him running almost entirely on fumes. He's not seriously injured, which is the standard he's been measuring success by for a while now, and that alone says everything about where his career is at. He limps out through the dungeon exit and checks his reward. Standard C-rank loot. Nothing special, nothing that's going to change his life trajectory in any meaningful direction. He pockets it, starts walking home, and that's when the world decides it's done waiting around. The rift destabilization comes out of nowhere. 1 second Jae-hyun is walking through the outer edge of the dungeon zone, and the next the entire area is vibrating like something massive just got very angry on the other side of reality. The rift doesn't just destabilize, it explodes. A monster, not C rank, not B rank, not anything that has any business being in this zone, tears through the barrier and lands in the middle of the street like it just got kicked out of a dimension that couldn't handle it anymore. The monster is massive, built like a wall of muscle and spite with a mana signature that's pinging somewhere in the A-rank neighborhood. Practically every hunter in the vicinity is backing off immediately, and the civilian evacuation alarms are already going off in the background. Jae-hyun looks at this thing and feels something ice-cold crawl from the base of his spine all the way up to his skull. He should run. Every sensible instinct he has is screaming at him to retreat and wait for higher-ranked hunters to handle this. But there's a kid, right in the path of the monster, frozen in place, too scared to move while the thing raises one enormous limb for a strike that is going to end that kid's life in about 4 seconds if nobody does anything. Jae-hyun doesn't think. He just moves. He throws himself into the space between the kid and the monster, throwing up the best mana barrier he can manage on short notice. It holds for about 2 seconds before the monster's strike cracks it like a dropped phone screen, but those 2 seconds are enough for someone to yank the kid out of the way. Then the full force of the blow connects with Jae-hyun directly, and there is a sound like the world's worst car crash. He doesn't die immediately. That's almost more cruel than if he had. He's conscious long enough to register that he's on the ground, that the pain is everywhere and nowhere at the same time, and that the monster is looming over him with its glowing wrong-colored eyes looking down at him like he's the most disappointing obstacle it's encountered all day. His last coherent thought before everything goes dark is that he probably should have run. And then, nothing. For exactly 3 seconds, there's nothing but silence and dark and the distant sensation of floating in a space that doesn't have walls or a floor or anything you could point to and call real. Jae-hyun exists in that space and doesn't exist in it at the same time, which is exactly as confusing and disorienting as it sounds. And then a voice. It doesn't come from any particular direction. It fills the entire dark space like water fills a glass, even, complete, impossible to locate or ignore. The voice is unhurried, unimpressed, has the specific energy of someone who has seen so many things happen over so many thousands of years that they have long since stopped being surprised by any of it. So you died. Jae-hyun, to his credit, takes this relatively well. He doesn't scream. He doesn't break down. He processes the information with the same resigned acceptance that he has been applying to bad news for the better part of 3 years. He died. Okay, that's a thing that happened. He asks, apparently into the empty dark, if this is the afterlife. No, says the voice. Not the afterlife. Something else. Something that the voice described, with the patience of a being explaining basic arithmetic to someone who keeps getting the answer wrong, as an opportunity, a second chance, a reset. If Jae-hyun is interested, that would send him back 3 years to the point right before his career started going sideways. He would go back with everything. His memories, his knowledge of the future, every dungeon disaster, every gate failure, every major event that he watched unfold from the outside. All of it. He'd carry it back with him like a backpack full of extremely useful contraband. There's a catch, of course. There's always a catch with these things. The voice belongs to Hela. Not a random supernatural entity, not some unnamed cosmic force. Hela, as in the Norse goddess who governs the domain of the dead, who has apparently had her eye on Min Jae-hyun for reasons she is being decidedly vague about. And the opportunity she's offering comes with a contract. She'll send him back, give him access to a system that no ordinary hunter has access to, and occasionally provide guidance when the situation calls for it. In return, Jae-hyun will pursue mythic tier items, artifacts of divine origin that have been scattered across dungeons and hidden within the world since the cataclysm began, and deliver them to her. Simple enough, in theory. Genuinely terrifying in practice, since mythic items are not the kind of thing you walk into a convenience store and pick up off the shelf. They're found in the most dangerous dungeons in the world, guarded by monsters that can delete high-ranked hunters like their side quest. Jae-hyun doesn't even hesitate. Deal, he says, with the energy of a man who has exactly nothing left to lose. The dark begins to collapse inward. The floating sensation reverses. The silence fills with a noise that sounds like the world rewinding on a very large spool. Min Jae-hyun wakes up 3 years in the past, gasping in a bedroom that smells like instant ramen and poor financial decisions, staring at a ceiling he recognizes as his childhood room. He's 20 years old again, and this time, he actually has a plan. Jae-hyun does not immediately leap out of bed and start doing pull-ups while mentally composing his list of future objectives. Instead, he lies there for a solid 3 minutes just breathing, because regressing in time is apparently quite taxing on a person's system and his heart is doing things hearts aren't designed to do for any extended period. He sits up slowly and looks at his hands. They're his hands, same shape, same calluses in roughly the same places, but there's something different about them. Something subtle that he can feel more than see, like the mana that runs through his body is moving a little little differently than it used to. Less obstructed, more present. He reaches for the notification that's already hovering at the edge of his perception, because he's already learned from the previous timeline that the system shows up early and has a lot to say. System notification. Contract established. Hela's blessing has been applied to the host. Mythic item collection quest active. Subclass granted. Demonic divine warrior. Initial stat parameters will be recalibrated to reflect accumulated potential. Jaehyun reads this, then reads it again. Demonic divine warrior sounds like something a 12-year-old named their character in an RPG at 3 in the morning, but the stat readout that follows is nothing to laugh at. His base mana pool has already jumped significantly compared to what a normal 20-year-old awakened hunter should be showing. His physical parameters are elevated. His mana sensitivity is off the chart, meaning he can feel magical energy with a precision that most B-rank hunters spend years developing. Not S-rank stats. Not yet. He hasn't earned those. But the starting line is significantly further ahead than it was the first time around, and that alone changes everything. He checks the date on his phone, confirms it. 3 years back, exactly where Hela said she'd drop him. His academy entrance exams for Millennium are in 2 months. 2 months to prepare for an exam that, in the first timeline, he passed with completely middling scores that earned him a spot at a significantly less prestigious institution. 2 months to train, strategize, and figure out how to enter Korea's top hunter academy without tipping anyone off that he's working with future knowledge and a divine blessing from the goddess of death. He gets up, puts on his training clothes, and starts stretching with the specific focus of a man who just got handed the reset button on his entire life and has absolutely zero intention of wasting it. Outside his window, Seoul moves through its morning routine, completely unaware that something in the fabric of what was supposed to happen just got rearranged by a Norse deity with a grudge against stagnation. Jaehyun's first priority, before training, before strategy, before anything, is information. He knows the broad strokes of the next 3 years better than anyone alive, but knowledge gets stale when details shift, and details always shift. He needs to update his mental map of where things are right now, 3 years back, so he doesn't stumble over discrepancies. He pulls out his laptop and starts working through everything he can find. Hunter rankings, guild affiliations, dungeon difficulty classifications, current records on gate activity across Korea. He's building context, cross-referencing what he remembers with what's documented, and the process is genuinely sobering in a way he wasn't entirely expecting. Because looking at the world from 3 years back makes the disasters he knows are coming feel very, very close. There are people right now who are alive and healthy and completely unaware of what's headed their direction. There are dungeons that haven't broken out yet, but will. There are gates that are currently classified as stable that will destabilize catastrophically in under 18 months and take dozens of hunters with them. And in the original timeline, Jaehyun was too mediocre to do anything about any of it. The taste in his mouth when he thinks about that is something he's going to be using as fuel for the next 2 months. He closes the laptop, goes back to the notes he's been keeping in a physical notebook, because some instincts from the gaming era of his life die hard, and starts writing down his actual plan. Not the vague, be stronger this time, aspirations of a man who just woke up in his own past, but the specific, tactical, step-by-step breakdown of what needs to happen and in what order. Step 1. Millennium Academy. Not just pass the entrance exam. Ace it. Step 2. While at the academy, collect the mythic items that are connected to the early tier dungeon events he knows are coming. Use Hela's contract to access gates and dungeons that the system normally wouldn't route a C-rank hunter toward. Step 3. Build the foundation for a power level that, by the time the big disasters start arriving, actually means something. And throughout all of it, hide how much he knows. Because the moment people figure out he has foreknowledge of future events, he stops being Min Jaehyun, former mediocre hunter, and starts being a walking target for everyone who wants to own the most valuable information source in the country. He caps the pen, looks at the notebook, and feels something that takes him a second to identify. It's hope. Actual, concrete, not completely irrational hope. He hasn't felt that in a while. Before the academy exam, Jaehyun needs to get his hands on some gear. His current equipment is the standard starter kit for a 20-year-old who just awakened, and while his actual power base has been recalibrated by Hela's blessing, having decent equipment is what keeps you from looking suspiciously overpowered relative to your registered rank. He needs things that are good, but not mythic good. Not yet. He heads to the hunter's market, which is exactly what it sounds like, a district in Seoul that caters specifically to the hunter profession. Gear shops, apothecaries stocked with mana potions and recovery items, exchange centers for dungeon loot, and information brokers who will tell you things about upcoming dungeons for the right price. It's loud and crowded and smells faintly of mana residue, which has a kind of burnt metal quality to it that you either get used to or you don't. Jaehyun navigates through it with the ease of someone who's been here many times, which he has, just not from this point in his personal timeline. He has a budget, savings from doing some preliminary solo dungeon runs over the past 2 weeks, which when went significantly better than his dungeon runs usually went, and a very clear list of what he's looking for. He picks up a mid-tier mana weapon. Nothing flashy, nothing that's going to make anyone look twice at him during the entrance exam. The kind of sword that a hardworking, dedicated 20-year-old hunter who trained seriously for 2 months might plausibly walk in with. He adds a set of mana-conducting armor in the same category, and then stops at a crafting materials stall because there's something specific he's been meaning to check. Hila mentioned, in her very unhelpful way that seems to be her default communication mode, that certain mythic items aren't found in dungeons. They're found in components, fragments and materials that need to be assembled in the right combination to produce the item. It's like a crafting recipe, except the ingredients are scattered across 3 different dungeon types and 2 of them are guarded by monsters that ate a B-rank hunting party for breakfast last year. He makes note of the materials, doesn't buy anything yet, and files it under Phase 2 in the mental architecture of his plan. On his way back from the market, he passes a training facility and stops. He watches through the window for a moment, a group of aspiring hunters running through the kind of combat drills that fill the first year of academy training. Most of them look competent, but few look very good. One in particular, at the far end of the facility, is running a mana circulation exercise with an efficiency that honestly makes Jae-hyun raise an eyebrow. He doesn't catch a name or a face, just a flash of dark hair and movement that looks like the product of years of dedicated practice. He files that away too, for different reason. 2 months. He's got 2 months to become someone worth remembering. He starts walking faster. The training that follows is not glamorous. There is nothing cinematic about waking up at 5 in the morning every day and putting yourself through mana circulation drills that make your entire nervous system feel like it's being wrung out like a wet cloth. There is nothing aesthetically pleasing about running weighted laps around the block at 6 a.m. while the rest of the city is still asleep, or spending 4 hours per day working through combat technique with the kind of focus that leaves you too tired to do much of anything else in the evenings. What Jae-hyun has, though, that he didn't have the first time around, is knowledge of what actually worked. In the original timeline, he spent years chasing training methods that were either inefficient or actively counterproductive for his specific awakening type. He didn't figure out the right approach until he was 22, by which point the gap between him and his peers had already become the kind of mountain you don't just climb back over with effort and good intentions. This time, he goes directly to the methods that work. He knows his awakening type now, knows its strengths, knows where it wants to grow, knows the specific mana pathways that respond best to which technique. It's like having the cheat code for a game you've already played. The progress he makes in 6 weeks would have taken him 18 months the first time around, and even then only if he'd had the right guidance. He also gets his first real communication from Hila during this period. Not a grand, dramatic appearance, just a voice at the edge of his awareness during a late-night meditation session, dry and slightly impatient in tone, offering a correction on the mana density technique he's been working through. He's doing it wrong. Not disastrously wrong, just wrong in the specific way that will cap his ceiling about 30% lower than it needs to be if he doesn't fix it now. She explains the correct method with the energy of a professor who can't believe she has to say this twice, and Jae-hyun listens, adjusts, and feels the difference immediately in the way the mana moves through him. "You're better at explaining things than I expected," he tells her. A pause. Then, "You're slower at learning than I expected. We're even." He can't tell if she's being sarcastic or completely sincere, and somehow that's the most accurate summary of their entire working relationship. 6 weeks in, Jae-hyun decides it's time to test the waters with his first real dungeon run since the regression. Not a gate, he's not officially registered yet, and the registration system in the first timeline had all kinds of procedural delays that he'd rather skip entirely by going through the Academy's hunter registration pipeline, which is faster and more comprehensive. But there are practice dungeons, controlled training environments used by pre-awakening students and registered hunters doing calibration assessments, that he can access through a temporary permit. He gets the permit, books a slot at the nearest training facility, and walks into what is essentially a tutorial dungeon for someone who is, on paper, a recently awakened prospect at the bottom of the ability ladder. The dungeon is an F-rank training gate, forest environment, weak monster spawn, designed to give beginners their first real combat experience in a controlled setting with facility staff monitoring from the outside, the kind of thing that takes most people about 45 minutes to clear comfortably. Jae-hyun clears it in 9 minutes. He doesn't go all out. He very deliberately does not go all out. 9 minutes is fast enough that it'll register on the calibration assessment as promising, rather than needs further investigation, and promising is exactly the profile he wants to be building right now. He doesn't activate any of the ability constructs that Hela's blessing has been quietly cooking in the background. He fights the way a hard-working, talented 20-year-old would fight, with good technique, good fundamentals, and the kind of efficiency that suggests serious preparation without suggesting anything supernatural. He comes out of the dungeon, turns in his assessment form, and watches the facility staff record his numbers with expressions that hover somewhere between impressed and surprised. The numbers are good. For a pre-academy prospect, they're genuinely excellent, but not alarming. Not the kind of excellent that makes people start asking questions they shouldn't be asking. He collects his calibration report and heads home to review it privately. The real numbers, the ones the system shows him, not the calibrated public-facing output, are considerably more dramatic. His actual mana pool is sitting at a level that most second-year Millennium students would struggle to match. His physical parameters are pressing on the upper edge of the B-rank ceiling, and his mana control precision, which Hila has been hammering at for 6 weeks, is operating at a level of efficiency that most hunters never reach at all. He's not S-rank. He wants to be clear with himself about that. He hasn't earned S-rank. He doesn't have the items, doesn't have the techniques, doesn't have the full depth of experience to operate at that level. But he has the foundation, and the foundation is significantly more impressive than it looks from the outside. Which is exactly the point. He closes the system readout, makes some notes in his physical notebook, and starts preparing for the academy entrance examination. The exam date arrives with the kind of weather that Korean springs default to when they can't decide between doing something dramatic or being perfectly pleasant. Overcast, slightly humid, the air carrying that particular quality that makes everything feel like it's holding its breath. Jae-hyun takes the early subway to the examination site with a bag that has exactly what he needs and nothing more. The entrance examination for Millennium Academy has 2 components. First, a written assessment covering hunter theory, dungeon classification systems, mana mechanics, and historical major gate events. Second, a practical combat evaluation that tests mana control, physical output, weapon proficiency, and, increasingly important in recent years, tactical adaptability. Jae-hyun can do the written portion in his sleep. He lived through the events that make up most of the history section. The mana theory questions are things he's been studying from advanced texts for 6 weeks specifically because he wanted to walk in and make the written portion look easy. He finishes the written exam with time to spare, checks his answers twice, and submits it with the same unhurried energy of a person who has already taken this test before. The practical component is where things get interesting. The practical examination takes place in a specialized evaluation arena, a dungeon gate that's been stabilized and calibrated to E-rank difficulty specifically for the purpose of testing applicants in a real but relatively safe environment. The candidates are sent in sequentially and timed, with their performance evaluated against a rubric that covers everything from monster kill efficiency to mana usage to decision-making under pressure. There are about 300 candidates total across the examination period. Jae-hyun's slot is mid-afternoon, which gives him time to watch a few of the earlier runs from the observer platform before his turn comes up. Most candidates are solid. This is Millennium's entrance exam. The people who show up here have already been pre-screened, and the general competence level is a significant step above what you'd see at an average Hunter Academy exam. There are a few standout, the kind of candidates who move through the evaluation dungeon with a smoothness that speaks to years of dedicated training. And then there's one candidate who doesn't just look good. She looks like she's on an entirely different plane of competition from everyone else on the platform. Dark hair, composed expression, moving through the dungeon with mana control that looks absolutely surgical, not a single unit wasted. Every technique applied at exactly the right moment for exactly the right effect. The examiner monitoring her run is writing things down so quickly it looks like he's trying to document a natural phenomenon before it disappears. She clears the evaluation dungeon with a clean time and a mana efficiency rating that makes the calculator the examiner is holding visibly unhappy about its own limitations. Jae-hyun watches from the platform and feels something click into place. He knows that name from the first timeline. Seo Aina, top-ranked incoming student, year after year one of Millennium's most decorated graduate, currently regarded as the most technically gifted mage-type hunter in her generation. In the original timeline, Jae-hyun graduated from a different academy and heard about Seo Aina only through reputation and news coverage. He never actually met her. Now he's watching her absolutely demolish an entrance examination 20 feet away from him, and in about 15 minutes, they're going to be taking the same entrance exam for the same institution. He finds that prospect significantly more interesting than he expected. His slot comes up. He heads to the evaluation gate, checks in with the examiner, and receives the standard briefing. He nods through it all. He knows the layout of the evaluation dungeon from his research, knows the monster distribution, knows the specific traps that trip up most candidates in the second chamber. He is, once again, working with the unfair advantage of having done his homework at a level nobody else in this examination has matched. He enters the gate. The evaluation dungeon is a 3-chamber layout. First chamber, wave defense, where the candidate has to repel a series of monster spawns without retreating past a marked line. Second chamber, navigation puzzle with monster interference. Find the correct path through a branching corridor system while fending off ambushes. Third chamber, a mini-boss boss encounter with an E-rank gate guardian that tests direct combat capability. Jae-hyun moves through the first chamber with the clean, unhurried efficiency of someone who is deliberately not using the full extent of what he can do. His mana output is calibrated. His weapon work is precise and technically excellent without being supernatural. He's performing at the level of a very well-prepared, genuinely talented candidate, and not 1 centimeter above. The second chamber is where most candidates lose time, because the navigation puzzle is designed to reward instinct over calculation and the monster ambushes are specifically placed to break concentration at critical decision point. Jae-hyun takes the correct path, because he memorized the correct path, because of course he did, dispatches the ambush monsters with the same measured efficiency, and arrives at the third chamber in a time that puts him in the top tier of the afternoon cohort. The Gate Guardian is a large, fast, E-rank cave beast with a charging attack that can catch unprepared candidates off guard and a magic resistance that makes raw mana blasts less effective than they look. Most candidates spend significant time and mana working around the magic resistance before figuring out that physical mana enhancement is the optimal approach. Jae-hyun figures this out very quickly. His enhanced weapon technique, not the full expression of it, just the functional version he's letting people see, cuts through the cave beast's defense with the kind of clean efficiency that makes the examiners watching the monitoring screen exchange a meaningful look. The Guardian goes down in under 2 minutes. He walks out of the evaluation gate, turns in his assessment materials, and stands in the cool afternoon air while the examiner processes his scores. The score that comes back is excellent. Not unprecedented. Not the kind of score that's going to make headline, but excellent. Top 5% of the entire examination cohort. A result that fully justifies a recommendation for admission to the main program and puts him in the running for the accelerated track. The examiner gives him a look that's approximately 40% professional approval and 60% "Where did you come from?" Jae-hyun gives him a polite nod and goes to find a vending machine because he's been in a dungeon for the better part of 2 hours and he really wants a cold drink. The acceptance letter arrives 11 days later. Standard format, official Millennium Academy letterhead, informing Min Jae-hyun that he has been accepted into the Academy's Hunter training program, main course, Class A assignment. Class A, not Class B, which is where the majority of the incoming year ends up. Class A is for the top scoring 25% of the admitted cohort, the candidates who placed high enough across both assessment components to be tracked toward advanced development from day one. It has better instructors, more intensive training schedules, greater access to the Academy's high-tier dungeon facilities, and the kind of reputation that follows you when you leave. Jae-hyun looks at the letter for a long moment. In the original timeline, he went to a different school entirely. The idea of being here, at Millennium, with an A- class designation, it's a strange sensation. Not quite surreal. More like stepping through a door you always knew existed but never got close enough to use before. He calls his mother to tell her the news. Her reaction is everything. The kind of overwhelmed happiness that parents produce when their kid does something that outpaces every expectation they were quietly trying to lower for their own emotional protection. She cries a little, which Jae-hyun absolutely was not prepared for, and tells him she knew he'd do something that would make them proud. His father, in the background, makes a sound that is technically stoic but clearly isn't. Jae-hyun hangs up and stands in his room for a minute, very carefully keeping his expression neutral about how much that phone call affected him. Then he starts packing for the Academy dormitory, because there is no version of his plan that involves getting emotional and losing focus when there is this much work left to do. Millennium Academy is located in a district of Seoul that was specifically restructured after the cataclysm to accommodate hunter training infrastructure. The campus is larger than it looks from the outside, sprawling training facilities, multiple specialized dungeon gates maintained for student use, a central academic building that houses everything from theory classrooms to equipment management to the health and recovery center. It's impressive in the specific way of an institution that has been funded by an entire nation's worth of priority allocation. Jae-hyun arrives on the first day of orientation week carrying exactly what he needs and nothing he doesn't. He navigates to his dormitory assignment, drops his gear, and takes stock of the building. His room is a standard double. He has a roommate. The roommate isn't in yet when Jae-hyun arrives, so he claims the bed near the window, which has better monitoring angles of the courtyard, and starts organizing his space with the systematic focus of someone who has been planning this move for 2 months. He's midway through setting up his study materials when the door opens and the roommate walks in. An Hoyeon, slightly taller than Jae-hyun, light hair, glasses, the specific energy of someone who is either very calm or very overwhelmed and you can't always tell which. He gives Jae-hyun a cautious nod and starts claiming the other side of the room with a level of deliberateness that suggests he, too, is the kind of person who thinks about room dynamic. They exchange the bare minimum of introductory information, names, Class A assignment confirmation, respective hometown district. It's the awkward efficiency of two people who both know they're going to be sharing this space for the foreseeable future and are proceeding carefully as a result. Jae-hyun doesn't give away anything beyond the obvious. He's pleasant enough. He just isn't particularly revealing, which An Hoyeon seems to either not notice or take in stride. Later, at the Class A orientation assembly, Jae-hyun scans the room and starts taking inventory. The Class A orientation assembly fills a mid-sized auditorium with approximately 60 incoming students, all of whom have the specific energy of people who are aware they scored well and are quietly trying to figure out how everyone else around them scored. There's a lot of subtle mutual assessment happening, which is completely understandable and also slightly amusing to observe from the outside. Jae-hyun finds a seat in the middle section, not front and not back, and continues his inventory. He spots Seo Aina immediately. She's sitting near the front with an expression of composed attention that hasn't changed much from the entrance examination. Dark uniform, posture that suggests years of discipline. There's a small space around her that other students have apparently left open without consciously deciding to, which is the kind of social geometry that happens around people who radiate a certain kind of confidence. He spots Kim Eugene about 3 rows back. Blonde, obviously bright-eyed, currently leaning over to say something to the person next to her that makes them grin despite themselves. She looks like she's already having a better time at orientation than most people have at things they actually chose to attend, which is a remarkable quality. The instructors take the stage and begin the standard orientation monologue. Jae-hyun listens to it with half his attention while cataloging the rest of the room. He's looking for the details, which students have the kind of mana presence that reads even from across a room, which ones are concealing their power level with varying degrees of success, which ones are performing confidence they don't quite have yet. There's one more person he's been looking for. He finds him toward the back of the auditorium. Min Seong-oh. His older brother is 2 years ahead of him, so he's not in the incoming Class A. Jae-hyun knew that. But the academy maintains an orientation mixer between years, and there he is, standing near the back wall with the easy, comfortable posture of someone who is entirely at home in this environment. He's taller than Jae-hyun, same dark hair, but where Jae-hyun tends to run cooler and more measured, Seong-oh has always had a different energy. Something sharper, something that looks like leadership from the right angle and something else entirely from a few angles to the left. In the first timeline, Jae-hyun admired his older brother. Not uncritically, not without friction. They were siblings, after all, with all the competitiveness that implied. But there was admiration. The older Min was good, genuinely good, in ways that Jae-hyun spent years trying to close the gap toward. He knows what that admiration eventually ran into. He knows what happened in the 4th year of the original timeline that turned sibling rivalry into something colder and harder. He doesn't let any of that register on his face. He looks at his brother from across the auditorium and files the citing under noted and returns his attention to the orientation briefing. One thing at a time. The week of orientation accelerates into the first week of actual classes, and Millennium Academy reveals itself to be exactly as intensive as its reputation suggests. The academic load for Class A is constructed on the assumption that everyone in the room is already working at or near the top of their current ability, and the practical training sessions that run parallel to the theory coursework are genuinely demanding in a way that separates preparation from wishful thinking very quickly. Jae-hyun thrives, and is very careful about exactly how much of that he lets show. The mana theory coursework is easy for him, not just because he has future knowledge, but because he spent 2 months specifically deepening his theoretical foundation, and the instructor, a compact, no-nonsense woman named Professor Yoon who clearly has zero tolerance for students who show up underprepared, doesn't find him a particularly interesting target for pointed questions because he answers them without hesitation and then waits for the next one. The physical training sessions are where he has to work the hardest at appearing appropriately challenged. His actual conditioning would put him at the top of the class by a considerable margin, which is not where he wants to be visibly right now. So he calibrates. He pushes hard enough to be clearly working. He makes the kind of small technical errors that a talented but still developing student would make. He completes the training benchmarks in times that put him consistently in the top 10 of the class without raising the specific kind of eyebrows that follow outlier performance. It's exhausting in a way that has nothing to do with the training itself. Performing mediocrity when you're capable of more requires a constant, low-level attention that compounds over a full day. He goes back to his dorm room each evening and lets himself actually recover, both from the physical exertion and from the sustained performance of being less than he is, and spends an hour with his system interface reviewing the day's progress against his internal benchmark. The first time Jaehyun has a real conversation with Kim Yoojin, it happens during a break between the afternoon theory block and the evening practical session, in the building's common area over the kind of vending machine coffee that only tastes acceptable when you're already too tired to be picky. She starts the conversation. This is very consistent with everything he knows about her from Reputation. Yoojin is not the kind of person who waits for circumstances to naturally produce social interactions. She manufactures them. She walks up with 2 cups of the terrible vending machine coffee and hands him one with the easy confidence of someone who has decided they're going to know a person and is simply proceeding on that assumption. "You're Min Jaehyun, right? From the entrance exam morning cohort. Not a question. I saw your run from the observer platform. The way you handled the second chamber was really clean." Jaehyun accepts the coffee, considers the opening for half a second. "You caught that? I was specifically watching how people handled the navigation section." She drops into the seat next to him with the comfortable ease of a person for whom personal space is a polite suggestion rather than a boundary. Most people overcommit to the left branch because it looks more direct. You went right immediately. You either figured it out on the fly, which would be impressive, or you knew the layout going in. He takes a sip of the terrible coffee and doesn't confirm or deny either theory. She grins like he's just confirmed the interesting thing about him that she suspected. "I'm Yoojin. Kim Yoojin. I'm not going to ask which one it was because the answer is obviously the second one, and watching people try not to admit they overprepared for something is one of my favorite things." Jaehyun looks at her for a moment. She has the kind of directness that could be irritating and is, in this particular instance, somewhat refreshing. "You overprepared for it too," he says, not a question. She points at him like he just passed a test. "Memorized the layout from 3 different publicly available dungeon surveys and cross-referenced them against the modification records in the official examination filing database, which was technically accessible to anyone who knew it existed, but nobody ever bothers to look." She pauses. "I should not have told you that. That's my interesting secret. I won't tell anyone," he says. "I know." She sounds completely certain. "You don't seem like someone who shares information casually." That observation is more accurate than she probably realizes, but he just nods. They sit through the rest of the break in something that isn't quite silence and isn't quite conversation, more like 2 people who have mutually recognized a certain useful quality in each other and are content to exist in the same space without needing to fill every second of it with noise. It's not the most elaborate beginning to a friendship that has ever existed, but it's more honest than most. The first encounter between Jaehyun and Seo Aina happens in a training facility, which is fitting for 2 people whose entire interaction over the coming year is going to be defined primarily by what happens in training contact. It's the 3rd week of classes. The afternoon practical session is a mana refinement drill, paired exercises where 2 students work in close proximity to test their ability to maintain control of their own output while managing the interference of another person's mana field. It's a technique exercise, not a competition, but it has a competitive energy to it anyway because Class A students treat most things like competitions whether they mean to or not. Jaehyun gets paired with Seo Aina, which is either random luck or the universe's idea of an interesting afternoon, and takes up position across from her with the composed, focused energy he uses as his default public-facing setting. The drill begins. They activate their respective mana outputs to the calibration level the instructor specifies, and Jaehyun gets his first direct reading of what Seo Aina's mana actually feels like from up close. It's cold. Not temperature cold. Mana doesn't have a temperature exactly, but her affinity is ice attribute, and there's a quality to it that registers in the bones before it registers in the conscious mind. Precise is the word that comes to mind immediately. Her output is extraordinarily precise. No waste, no diffusion. Every unit of mana going exactly where she intends it to go with a control that speaks to the kind of foundational training that starts when you're very young and never really stops. She notices him noticing. "Your control is good," she says, which is not warm exactly, but isn't dismissive either. Just an observation delivered with the directness of someone who doesn't see the point of flattery or its opposite. "Better than the score record suggested." "The assessment conditions weren't ideal," Jaehyun says, which is technically true. Her expression changes very slightly. Not a smile. Something more like an adjustment in assessment. "What's your attribute affinity?" He tells her. It's not a secret. It's on his examination record. Her eyes track slightly, like she's running calculations in the background that she doesn't feel obligated to share with him. "Interesting combination," she says after a moment. The drill continues. Neither of them says much more, but there's something in the interaction that sits with Jaehyun afterward. Not discomfort, just the recognition that Seo Aina is paying considerably more attention than she appears to be, and that being in her proximity is going to require him to maintain a calibration level that he wouldn't need to bother with for most of his classmates, which is, frankly, useful. A person who genuinely challenges his concealment is better practice than a room full of people he can navigate on autopilot. The first month of academy life establishes patterns. Routines form with the inevitability ability of water finding a path downhill, and Jae-hyun builds his around 3 layers: the public-facing layer that Class A sees, the semi-private layer that his system records, and the deep private layer where the actual development work is happening. The public layer, solid student, top 10 but not top 1 placement, generally cooperative in group exercises, a little reserved socially but not off-putting about it, the kind of person people describe as serious, in a tone that acknowledges the word as neither compliment nor criticism. The semi-private layer, his actual training metrics, which he reviews in the evenings and which show improvement curves that would alarm anyone watching them if the starting points weren't obscured. The deep private layer, the Mythic system work. This is where Hila enters the picture regularly, and enters is a gentle description of her approach to communication, which is more like a professor appearing at the corner of your awareness and beginning a lecture without asking if you have time. Jae-hyun has gotten used to it. He has, in the past month, come to appreciate the precision with which she delivers technical information even when the delivery method is somewhat lacking in social warmth. She's identified the first mythic item component he should be looking for. It's in a specific B-rank dungeon 2 hours outside Seoul, a piece of an artifact called the Frost Seal that has been sitting in the dungeon's deepest chamber for 11 years without anyone retrieving it, because the dungeon is classified as requiring a party of at least 3 B-rank hunters to clear safely. Jae-hyun says internally, in the specific tone of a person who has already thought through several less safe alternatives. Hela's response is the mental equivalent of a shrug. She doesn't tell him it'll be easy. She does tell him the layout and the boss's specific weakness, which amounts to roughly the same thing if you plan correctly. He notes it, starts building the plan, and continues his very normal-looking academy day. An Hoyeon, his roommate, is not someone Jae-hyun ends up knowing well in the first month. They're civil. The room functions smoothly. Hoyeon is organized, considerate about shared space, and has the kind of studying intensity in the evenings that Jae-hyun finds neither intrusive nor particularly surprising given the caliber of the student body. What does register is that Hoyeon is dealing with something that he keeps almost but not quite successfully concealing. Not in his academic work, which is consistently strong. In the quieter moments, the way he looks at the Class A rankings when they go up at the end of the first assessment period, the specific expression he uses when someone mentions family legacy in the context of hunter bloodline, the slightly too careful way he maintains the composed exterior in every social interaction. Jae-hyun doesn't ask. It's not his business, and he's in no position to be digging into other people's hidden layers when his own have more levels than a game dungeon. But he notes it in the same way he notes everything else, filed under, understood, relevant at an unknown future point. The first Class A dungeon field exercise is announced at the end of the 5th week. It's a mandatory component of the curriculum. Millennium's pedagogy is built on the philosophy that theoretical knowledge without dungeon application is academic decoration without practical value, and the first field exercise introduces students to an actual working dungeon environment under instructor supervision. The dungeon selected is an F-rank gate about 40 minutes from campus. Easy classification, controlled conditions, instructor oversight from designated safe zone. It's genuinely not much more challenging than the entrance examination dungeon. It's designed to assess how students perform in a real dungeon environment rather than the controlled pressure of an exam. The primary evaluation criteria are mana management efficiency, combat decision-making, and tactical communication for the paired elements of the exercise. Class A is divided into groups of 4 for the exercise. Jae-hyun ends up in a group with Kim Yujing, a guy named Park Seojin who is good-natured and solidly built, and a 4th student named Choi Dabin who is quiet and has the specific energy of someone who is going to be considerably better than people expect her to be once she stops holding herself back. The group dynamic takes approximately 90 seconds to establish itself. Yujing slides naturally into the communication role because she's constitutionally incapable of not doing so. Seojin falls in as the forward combat position because he's built for it and knows it. Dabin takes the support position without being asked, and Jae-hyun slots into the position that none of the others naturally occupied, which is tactical overview. Nobody appoints him to it. He just starts doing it, calling out positions and approach angles during the first encounter that happen to be exactly correct, and within 5 minutes the group has implicitly organized itself around his direction without anyone having a formal conversation about leadership. He tries not to make it look like he's the most experienced combatant in this F-rank dungeon by approximately 3 years. He succeeds, mostly. The dungeon itself is a forest-type environment, low light, dense undergrowth, mostly populated by wolf-type monsters in the E to F range. Standard fare. The group moves through the first section cleanly, handling the wolf encounters with the combination of Seojin's direct engagement and Yujing's area control support while Jae-hyun and Dabin manage angles. What makes the exercise interesting interesting is the second section. The dungeon's second area has an environmental element, a visibility reduction effect that cuts mana sensing range significantly and forces groups to work with degraded information. Most first-year students lose coordination in this section because they've been relying on mana sensing as their primary situational awareness tool, and suddenly having that tool cut by 60% is disorienting. Jae-hyun has been operating mostly on physical observation since the exercise started, partly as discipline and partly because using the full extent of his mana sensing in an F-rank dungeon would be like using a telescope to look at something a foot away from your face. The visibility reduction barely affects him. He keeps the same approach and the rest of the group orients around his continued calm, which steadies them enough to maintain coherence through the section. The instructor watching their group's feed from the safe monitoring point makes a note that is considerably longer than the standard checkmark. The boss encounter at the end of the dungeon is a large F-rank wolf variant, alpha designation, elevated stats, a charging attack and a howl skill that buffs nearby mobs if any are still alive. Jae-hyun's group has been methodical enough in the earlier sections that there are no remaining mobs when the alpha appears, so the howl is a non-factor. The boss fight takes 4 minutes. Good time for a first-year group. Not exceptional time, not record-setting, but clean and efficient with no injuries and excellent resource management. The group clears and walks out to the sound of the instructor offering genuine approval that doesn't feel like pity applause. Eugene is elated in the specific way of someone who has been competitively focused for most of the exercise and can now let the satisfaction out. Seojin is grinning. Dabin allows herself a small smile that transforms her whole face for a second before she regains composure. Jae-hyun accepts the completion assessment with a nod and starts mentally reviewing the parts of the exercise where he could have managed the concealment calibration better. You've done this before, Eugene says, not accusatory, just certain, while they walk back to the bus. Not at this dungeon, he says, which is technically true. She accepts this with the expression of someone cataloging information they'll return to later. Week 7 brings the first assessment ranking publication. Millennium releases internal standings for Class A at the end of each assessment cycle, not for external publication, just for internal tracking and instructor reference. The students see them anyway, obviously, because information wants to be free and a bulletin board in a hallway is about as private as shouting out a window. Top of the list is Seo Aina. Nobody is surprised. Her practical evaluation scores are in a category by themselves and her theory performance is excellent across the board. The gap between her and second place is visible even without measuring it precisely. Jae-hyun is in 4th, Eugene is in 7th, An Hoyeon is in 12th, which is solid but considerably lower than his daily performance would suggest is his ceiling. 4th is fine. 4th is exactly where Jae-hyun wants to be, high enough to justify the academy's investment in him, high enough that his early track record looks strong and consistent, not so high that he's being scrutinized for the wrong reasons. The 4th place student doesn't get profiled in the assessment reviews. The 4th place student is a note in the margin rather than the headline. He's comfortable being a note in the margin. For now, the person he wants to watch is the name in second, Lee Junho, a student Jae-hyun doesn't have a detailed history on from the first timeline, because they were at different schools and never crossed paths. But here, in Class A, Lee Junho is performing at a level that suggests either prodigious natural talent or a training background that rivals Seo Aina's, possibly both. He adds Lee Junho to the active monitoring list and continues. A conversation with Hila that happens mid-week produces significantly more information about the first mythic item quest than Jae-hyun had when he started planning it. The artifact, the Frost Seal, is not, as it turns out, purely a defensive item the way its listed classification suggests. Hila, with the reluctant honesty of someone who has decided she might as well be comprehensive since she's already talking, reveals that the Frost Seal is one of 3 components of a much larger divine artifact whose full name and function she declines to share right now. Jae-hyun takes this with the resigned acceptance of a man who knew the project was bigger than it was being presented when the goddess offering the deal refused to give a full scope summary at the time of contract signing. Why are you only telling me this now? He asked. Because 3 weeks ago you would have found it overwhelming and made poor strategic decisions as a result. The tone is not unsympathetic. It's more like the specific calm of a person who has managed someone's information intake very deliberately. He thinks about arguing this and then decides she's probably right and lets it go. The Frost Seal component is still the first priority. He needs access to the B-rank dungeon. dungeon, which means he needs a justification for being in a dungeon significantly above his registered classification. The Academy's dungeon access system is strict. Students can only enter gates rated to within one classification of their registered rank without explicit instructor approval and supervised conditions. His registered rank is E. The dungeon is B. He needs to either raise his registered rank legitimately, which takes time, or find a way to access the dungeon through a channel that doesn't route through the Academy's access system, which is either clever or reckless depending on how it goes. He starts researching the second option. The answer turns out to be moderately clever and only slightly reckless, which Jae-yoon considers an acceptable balance. The Hunter Association's dungeon access system has a specific provision for what's called monitored advancement assessment, a formal process where a hunter who believes their registered rank doesn't accurately reflect their current capability can apply to attempt a dungeon above their classification under supervision. The results either confirm the assessment, triggering a rank evaluation, or they don't, in which case the attempt is recorded but doesn't affect standing. Most hunters don't use this provision because the optics of attempting a dungeon above your rank and performing poorly are uncomfortable, and the social cost of being publicly seen to overestimate yourself is significant in a community built on measurable performance. Jae-yoon puts in the application for a D-rank dungeon advancement assessment, which is one step above his registered E classification. He's not going to go from E to B in one jump. That would require an explanation he doesn't currently have. But E to D is defensible. D to C following performance in the D assessment is defensible. He's building a paper trail, a legitimate-looking trajectory that explains an accelerating rank progression in terms of dedicated training and accumulated development. The examiner who processes his application is skeptical in the professional, paperwork-based way of bureaucracy. He asks follow-up questions, wants a training log, wants an instructor reference. Jae-yoon provides all of it. The training log is real. He's been keeping records. The instructor reference is from Professor Yoon, who provides it with the specific efficiency of someone who has assessed hundreds of students and has a clear internal ranking of which ones will accomplish what they set out to do and which ones won't. The assessment is scheduled for 2 weeks later. In the meantime, he keeps his academy obligations at their established calibration level and continues the background work on the Gila contract. She's been walking him through the Mythic item framework in more detail, the way these artifacts function, why they exist, what their collection serves in the larger context of something she is still being strategically vague about. He knows enough to know that the vagueness is intentional. She's managing his information intake, the way she said. He's choosing to trust that the management is at least approximately in his interest. The day of the D-rank advancement assessment arrives with better weather than the entrance exam. Clear and cold, the kind of morning that makes everything feel slightly more consequential than it probably is. The assessment dungeon is a ruins-type gate on the outskirts of Seoul, classified D for its monster density and a mid-boss encounter about 2/3 of the way through that most E-rank hunters genuinely cannot manage. The examiner is stationed at the entry point with a monitoring interface and the professionally neutral expression of someone who has done this many times and will do it many times more. Jae-yoon enters. The ruins dungeon is a different kind of environment than the forest types, harder surfaces, more vertical space, monster types that prioritize ambush tactics over the direct engagement that wolf types and beast types default to. The primary monster population is skeletal type, which has specific properties: reduced effectiveness of blunt physical attacks, high vulnerability to mana-enhanced weapon techniques, a tendency to operate in coordinated groups even at low intelligence ratings. He handles the first section methodically, not slowly, methodically, which is a different thing. He's choosing his engagements, managing his mana expenditure, working through the encounters in a way that looks like a very good E-rank hunter operating at the edge of their capability, which is the performance he's going for, and he executes it cleanly. The mid-boss is a D-rank armored skeleton knight with a passive mana absorption field that reduces incoming mana damage, a shield that it uses with surprising tactical sophistication for something with no brain tissue, and an attack speed that genuinely would be a serious problem for an actual E-rank hunter trying to deal with it alone. Jae-yoon lets it land a hit, just one, early in the fight, because a smooth clean win with no contact at all is going to raise questions about whether the E to D gap is actually the challenge it's supposed to be. The hit connects with his shoulder, rattles him, and he uses the stagger to reset his position, which looks like a recovery response and is also genuinely useful for the angle he wants on the knight's exposed opposed side. From there, the fight takes 4 minutes. He works the shield systematically, not the brute force approach, but the leverage technique that exploits the hinge point in the knight's grip pattern, which is something that requires precision rather than power. The knight's absorption field requires him to shift his mana application toward the physical enhancement side rather than direct output, which produces a different visual profile that is, in this context, the most accurate representation of what an E-rank hunter upgrading to D-rank looks like. He brings the knight down, clears the final section, exits the dungeon. The examiner's read on the results is that the performance is D-rank, maybe pressing toward D+. He notes the technique quality is particularly refined for the classification range and recommends Jae-yoon's rank be formally updated to D effective immediately, with a note suggesting consideration for C rank assessment pending one additional performance record. Jae-yoon accepts this with a nod, thanks the examiner with appropriate but not excessive gratitude, and starts building his plan for the C rank assessment. The B rank dungeon is closer now. Back at the academy, the D rank registration update processes through the system and hits the Class A boards the following Monday. Jae-yoon is now one of the higher registered students in the incoming cohort. Most of his classmates are still at E, which is normal for a first semester student with no pre-registration history. The small jump creates a mild ripple in the class dynamics, not dramatic but noticeable. Lee Junho is at D as well. Seo Ina registered at D rank on entry. She had pre-registration history from prior assessment work. A few others are at the same level. What Jae-yoon notices is that Seong-oh catches wind of the update. His older brother doesn't approach him directly about it. That's not Seong-oh's style. Direct approach is for when you want someone to know you're paying attention, and his brother has always preferred to make his observations from a slight distance and let the observed party wonder. But Jae-yoon catches the awareness in a hallway interaction. Seong-oh walking past in the opposite direction, making eye contact for exactly 1 second, the specific expression of someone recalibrating an assumption about a family member they thought they had fully mapped. Jae-yoon holds the eye contact for that 1 second and then looks forward and keeps walking. The message delivered is simple: I'm aware you're watching. I'm fine with that. What he doesn't say, because this is a hallway and it's not the time. I know exactly what you're going to do in approximately 18 months, and I have a plan for it. Kim Yoo-jin notices the registration update too, with the specific delight of someone who correctly predicted a thing and wants credit for having predicted it. I told Dabin you were going to clear that assessment first try, she says, at the vending machine coffee spot that has now become their unofficial meeting point between afternoon blocks. She said you were being optimistic about the difficulty. Dabin's assessment wasn't wrong, Jae-yoon says. The assessment was genuinely at the edge of my registered range. Yoo-jin gives him the look she uses when she suspects someone of being technically truthful while simultaneously being somewhat misleading. He's come to recognize it as one of her more precise expressions. You're going for C rank next, she says. Not a question. Eventually. How long? A month. Maybe 2. She processes this arithmetic against her assessment of his ability level and the look shifts to something more like impressed respect. What's your plan after that? He glances at her. She's asking because she genuinely wants to understand the strategic thinking, not because she's gathering information for any agenda. That's always been Yoo-jin's quality. Her curiosity is direct and honest, which makes it one of the easier kinds to navigate. I need to clear a specific dungeon for a personal project, he says. It requires a higher registration than I currently have. She nods like this is a completely reasonable explanation, because for a hunter who is clearly operating above their classification, it is. What kind of project? Item collection. She considers this. That's not something people usually talk about as a project. A pause. Unless they're going after something significant. He takes a sip of the terrible coffee and doesn't confirm or deny. Yoo-jin accepts this with the same equanimity she applies to everything she files under interesting but appropriately private, and changes the subject to the upcoming assessment review, which she has opinions about and is not shy about sharing. He's genuinely glad she doesn't push further. He's also, in a way he hadn't expected, genuinely glad she's the kind of person she is. 3 weeks after the D-rank assessment, Jae-yoon submits his C-rank advancement application. This one draws more attention from the Academy's faculty administration than the previous one. Advancing from E to D in 5 weeks is fast but not unheard of. Following that with a C-rank application 2 months into first semester is considerably less common. Professor Yoon calls him into her office for a conversation about it. She's the kind of educator who operates on the philosophy that most students are capable of more than they're being asked for, and that the job of good teaching is to find where the ceiling actually is rather than accepting the presented ceiling as accurate. She's assessed hundreds of students over her career at Millennium. She has, at this point, a very accurate instinct for when a student is performing at their actual level and when they're performing at a carefully managed approximation of it. She looks at him across the office desk with the direct, unhurried attention of someone taking the time to actually see what's in front of them. Your practical performance performance in the field exercises is consistently at the top of Class A, she says. Your theory scores are strong. Your advancement assessment performance was technically excellent in a way that's difficult to attribute purely to preparation. And now a C rank application 6 weeks after a D rank confirmation. She pauses. I'm not telling you not to apply. I'm asking you to explain your reasoning. Jae-hyun thinks about what to give her. She deserves more than a practiced non-answer, and more than that, he needs her reference for the application to process quickly. My development pace has been non-linear, he says. I trained extensively before the entrance exam through methods that are more efficient for my specific type than the standard preparation curriculum. The registered rank reflects where I was when I started that training, not where I am now. That's a careful way of saying your actual capability is ahead of your official record. Yes. She watches him for a moment. Then, by how much? He makes a decision. More than the C rank application suggests. A B. Then Professor Yoon does something he doesn't expect. She nods, slowly, with an expression that isn't surprised. Like this is the answer she was testing for, not information she didn't already suspect. The C rank assessment is approved, she says, but I'm going to be personally overseeing the evaluation instead of delegating it. She closes the folder on her desk. I want to understand what I'm looking at. He leaves her office with the application approved and the distinct sense that he's navigated that conversation with a slightly smaller safety margin than he'd prefer. The C rank assessment is a significantly more serious affair than the D rank version. The dungeon is a C classification labyrinth type, multiple floors, significant monster variety, a boss encounter with genuine A-rank difficulty at the individual enemy level, and a time component that makes passive clearance strategically unfeasible. Professor Yoon is at the monitoring station with the serious attention she promised. Jae-hyun checks in at the gate, runs through the pre-entry protocol, and enters. The labyrinth immediately introduces a navigational challenge, branching paths with no consistent logical structure that most explorers take significant time to map. Jae-hyun moves through it with more confidence than the environment usually permits, which is partly from the research he did in advance and partly from the improved mana sensing that Hela's recalibration has given him. He can feel the density differentials in the labyrinth's mana field that indicate the correct paths, which functions as a navigation tool that most hunters at this level don't have access to. He's careful to attribute any speed decisions to observable choices rather than invisible sensing, taking paths that have visible indicators a good hunter would notice, pausing briefly at decision points in a way that suggests he's weighing options even when he already knows the answer. The fights through the labyrinth floors are managed with increasing visibility of actual capability, because Professor Yoon is watching and part of what she's specifically looking for is a ceiling. He pushes up toward it, showing more of the real picture than he has in any previous assessment, while staying short of the elements that would require explanation. By the time he reaches the boss chamber on the final floor, he's been in the dungeon for 30 minutes. The boss, a C-rank chimera variant with 3 distinct attack patterns and a mana amplification ability that makes it considerably more dangerous than its classification suggests, is a genuine test. Jae-hyun fights it seriously. Not at full capacity, but seriously. The chimera is fast and the pattern switching is unpredictable in exactly the way that makes it dangerous, and there are 2 moments in the fight where taking damage isn't a choice but a necessity, where the alternative would be revealing a level of capability that he isn't ready to explain. He takes those hits, works through them, and brings the chimera down with a combination of physical pressure and precise mana application that is, from the outside, the performance of a very exceptional C-rank hunter. He exits the dungeon 23 minutes after entering the boss chamber. Total clear time, 53 minutes. For a C-rank labyrinth with a chimera boss, that is a remarkable time even for a tested C-rank hunter. For a student submitting a classification assessment, it is approximately 4 standard deviations from the expected range. Professor Yoon's face when he comes out is the face of someone who just had a well-maintained professional hypothesis thoroughly confirmed. The C-rank designation is processed same day. The C-rank registration changes things. Not dramatically, he's still a first-semester student, still navigating the same class schedule, still performing at the carefully managed public-facing level, but the profile he now carries is different. A first-semester student at C-rank, advancing from E in under 3 months, is notable in a way that the 4th-place Class A standing wasn't quite. People talk about it, not extensively, but consistently, the kind of low-level conversation thread that gets referenced in passing for several weeks before it's displaced by the next notable thing. He hears his name brought up twice in adjacent conversations he wasn't meant to be part of, and both times the framing is the same. Where did this guy come from, and why don't we have better information about him? The person he hears it from the second time is not a classmate. It's a third-year student who he recognizes from the upper-level training facility, which means it's reached the older cohort, which means it's reached the level of the student body where Min Seong-oh is currently operating. His brother's response to the escalating attention around Jae-hyun is not what most people would expect. Instead of bringing it up directly, again, not Seong-oh's style, he invites Jae-hyun to lunch. This is, technically, a normal family activity. Two brothers at the same school having a meal. It's entirely unremarkable from the outside. It is also, Jae-hyun knows with the certainty of someone who has known his brother for 20 years, not actually about lunch. They sit across from each other in the academy cafeteria with the comfortable awkwardness that has always characterized their interaction, the specific dynamic of two people who know each other well enough to read each other accurately and haven't always been happy about what that reading produces. Seong-oh leads with compliments, which is where he always starts. The C rank result is impressive. The advancement pace is remarkable. The examination performance was apparently discussed in the third-year cohort with genuine respect. He delivers all of this with the easy, natural warmth that makes him very effective in social situations. Because it's not entirely false, Jae-hyun knows. The admiration is real. The strategic interest is also real. Both things coexist in his older brother without apparent friction. Jae-hyun accepts the compliments without deflecting and without basking in them. "I'm proud of you," Seong-oh says, and it sounds genuine, because it is. "Thank you," Jae-hyun says, and means it. A pause. Then Seong-oh sets down his chopsticks and looks at his younger brother with an expression that has shifted from the social warmth to something slightly more honest. "You were E rank when you came in. Now you're C, and the way Professor Yoon talks about your assessment, that's not the language she uses for students who trained hard and got lucky. She hasn't said anything to me except the result. She doesn't need to. The observation alone says something." Seong-oh looks at him carefully. "What aren't you telling me?" Jae-hyun thinks about this question, about what he can say and what he can't, about the brother sitting across from him, the version that exists right now, 3 years before the event that reframes everything. "I trained seriously," he says. "My development pace is non-linear. That's all." Seong-oh looks at him for a long moment. Then he smiles, the slightly disappointed smile of someone who expected an honest conversation and got a careful one. "Okay," he says. "Non-linear, sure." They finish lunch. The conversation moves to other things: training schedules, the upcoming academy-wide assessment event, a mutual acquaintance from their shared social circle who Seong-oh is catching up with. Normal, easy, the kind of sibling interaction that looks, from the outside, like two people who are simply having a nice lunch. Jae-hyun goes back to his dormitory afterward and sits quietly for a few minutes before he starts his evening work. He's not ready to have the real conversation with his brother. He doesn't know if he ever will be. But something about sitting across the table from the version of Seong-oh that exists before everything happened and simply talking, it unsettles him in a way that's harder to categorize than he expected. He pushes it aside, opens his system, and pulls up the dungeon access application for the B-rank assessment. The B-rank gate dungeon that contains the frost seal component is called Vortex Ruins, named for the specific mana vortex phenomenon that occasionally disrupts magical detection equipment in the dungeon's inner chambers, a phenomenon that has made it both dangerous and interesting to researchers who study dungeon environmental effect. It's located in a designated hunter zone about 2 hours from Seoul by highway, and it requires a registered B rank or higher designation to enter through the standard access system. Jae-hyun is currently C rank. The advancement assessment from C to B is a significantly larger jump than his previous registrations. B rank is where the hunter hierarchy starts drawing meaningful distinctions between good hunter and professional hunter with career-defining capability. The assessment dungeon for a B rank evaluation is B classification by default, which creates a recursive access problem that the system resolves through a supervised application process that the association handles on a case-by-case basis. He submits the application. The case-by-case determination takes a week and comes back with conditions: supervised entry, a monitoring party of 2 B-rank certified association staff who will not assist but will observe, and a mandatory documentation requirement for any items retrieved. The documentation requirement is the only part that gives him pause. Mythic item components have a specific mana signature that doesn't match standard dungeon loot classifications. If the frost seal component is logged and classified accurately, it will attract attention from people who know what they're looking at. He spends 2 days researching how item classification documentation is processed and whether there's a legitimate way to request delayed classification for unusual items pending expert assessment. There's an in classified materials registration category that routes items through a specialist review process that can take 2 to 4 before week. It's not a cover-up. It's a bureaucratic delay that buys him time. He files it in advance of the assessment. The assessment day for the B-rank evaluation is the most significant Jaehyun has sat for since the entrance exam, for reasons that go well beyond the registration result. This dungeon contains something he actually needs. Not for the rank, for the mythic item quest. The stakes are categorically different from the advancement assessments that preceded this one. Hila is unhelpfully silent on the morning of the assessment, which is her version of expressing confidence, or possibly her version of not wanting to distract him when the situation calls for his full attention. Either way, he drives to the Vortex Ruins access point with the 2 association staff monitoring personnel and the specific internal stillness of someone who has done enough preparation that additional anxiety would be purely theoretical. The dungeon entrance is a stone arch formation that occurs naturally at the entrance of a dungeon that has existed for long enough to develop the kind of environmental character that makes first-time visitors instinctively slow down. There's a weight to the mana field here, not malicious, more like the presence of something very old and very settled. The vortex phenomenon Hila described isn't constant, it's intermittent, rolling through the dungeon's inner chambers in waves that the experienced can feel coming and the unprepared get caught in. Jaehyun enters. The monitoring staff take their observation positions outside. The dungeon's outer chambers are a statement of intent. The monster density is higher than lower-rated dungeons and the individual monster caliber is genuinely challenging. Stone golems with mana-reinforced shells, shadow-type creatures that use dimensional step movement, a flying creature called a void hawk that has detection suppression as a passive ability. Any of these would be a serious encounter for a C-rank hunter operating alone. Jaehyun handles the first 3 encounters with a precision and efficiency that stops representing C-rank capability approximately 12 seconds into the first fight. He's not going to limit himself here. There's nobody watching from inside the dungeon, and the stakes of actually failing this particular clearance are too high to manage the performance calibration. The stone golem goes down in 90 seconds through a combination of targeted mana-enhanced strikes at the joint seams, which are the golem's structural weak points, and a mana disruption technique that destabilizes the mana reinforcement in the shell long enough to create exploitable damage windows. The technique requires a level of mana sensitivity that most C-rank hunters haven't developed yet, but Jaehyun has been working on it specifically for this encounter. The shadow creatures are faster and require constant repositioning. They're drawn to mana output as an attack targeting mechanism, which means high-output direct attacks are counterproductive. He keeps his output low and deliberate, drawing the shadow creatures into pursuit patterns and then eliminating them during the repositioning window when their own movement takes them partially out of phase. It's a technique he theorized during preparation and is applying for the first time in live conditions, which is not ideal for a dungeon that will kill you if you get it wrong. It works. Not perfectly. There's a moment in the second shadow encounter where the timing is slightly off and he takes a glancing strike that opens a cut along his forearm. He registers the pain, does not stop, finishes the encounter, and proceeds. The Void Hawk is the most technically complex. The detection suppression means his mana sensing is unreliable in its presence, forcing him to rely entirely on physical observation, which requires the hawk to be in his field of view at all times during the fight. The bird is fast and uses its own suppression aura aggressively, hovering in and out of active suppression range in a way that seems almost deliberate. He keeps tracking it with visual focus alone, waits for the pattern to establish itself, and takes it down on the third dive approach with a precisely timed strike that hits its abbreviated winglock position. He takes a moment to breathe after the third encounter. His forearm is stinging. His mana expenditure is at about 40% for the outer chambers, which is manageable but not comfortable. Hela's voice at the edge of his awareness. 2 chambers in. The component is in the third inner chamber. Boss is the chamber's guardian. Be careful of the vortex timing. Useful information, he says quietly. Thank you. A pause that sounds faintly surprised. Then, don't thank me yet. The inner chambers of Vortex Ruins have a different quality than the outer sections. Heavier air, darker lighting, and the rolling sensation of the vortex phenomenon that Hila warned about. It moves through the chambers in waves at irregular intervals, and when it hits, it creates a temporary field effect that scrambles mana-based techniques and causes orientation disruption for anything that's not anchored to the physical environment. The first wave catches Jaehyun between chambers and he spends approximately 3 seconds genuinely disoriented, one hand on the stone wall, waiting for it to pass. When it does, he notes the time interval, calculates the approximate frequency, and adjusts his movement through the inner chambers to work with the cycle rather than against it. The boss of the third inner chamber is a B-rank construct, something between a stone elemental and a spectral entity, substantial enough to hit with physical force but partially non-physical in a way that requires mana-enhanced attacks to deal full damage. It's large, considerably larger than the outer chamber enemies, and it moves with the kind of slow inevitability quality that is somehow more threatening than speed. The fight is hard. Jae-hyun is genuinely working, drawing on reserves that the outer chambers depleted, managing his mana expenditure with the kind of careful rationing that tells you the tank is getting low. The construct's attacks are heavy and cover a wide area, and twice he has to sacrifice position to avoid being caught in a full strike envelope, which costs him time and setup. The vortex wave hits halfway through the fight, which is the worst possible timing. For about 4 seconds, his mana techniques are unavailable, which means he's operating entirely physically against a boss that requires mana enhancement to damage effectively. He uses those 4 seconds to get himself into the best possible position for when the wave passes close range, inside the construct's attack arc where its sweeping strikes are less effective, and the moment the vortex wave clears, he drives a full enhancement strike into the construct's core point with everything he has. The construct shudders. The mana structure that holds it together fractures. It takes 2 more full power strikes before it collapses, and when it does, the chamber floods with the dissipating mana of its dissolution, and there in the center of where it stood is a piece of crystal the size of his fist, glowing faintly blue-white. The frost seal component. He picks it up and feels the specific resonance of a mythic tier artifact even in fragmentary form, a kind of vibration that exists just below the frequency of anything audible, something that sits in the chest rather than the ears. Hila goes quiet in a way that feels like satisfaction rather than absent. Jae-hyun puts the component in his storage pack, notes the time, he's been in the dungeon for 83 minutes, and starts walking back toward the entrance. He emerges from Vortex ruins to find the 2 monitoring staff in a state of somewhat elevated concern, because 83 minutes is considerably longer than the expected clearance time, and the vortex readings from inside the dungeon had been irregular enough to register alarms on their detection equipment. They look at him, specifically, at the forearm with the treated cut, and at the mana depletion readings his system is putting out, which are lower than what a comfortable clearance produces, and the elder of the two does a professional assessment in about 4 seconds that lands correctly on, this person just cleared something harder than they should have been able to. Jae-hyun confirms the clearance, submits the assessment documentation on site, and routes the retrieved item through the unclassified materials registration he set up in advance. The monitoring staff don't push for details beyond the standard documentation requirements. They're assessment observers, not investigators. But the elder staff member, while processing the forms, says something under his breath that Jae-hyun half hears and doesn't think is meant for him. These numbers are B rank, not a question, not addressed to anyone, just the observation of a professional looking at data that doesn't quite fit the box it's supposed to fit in. Jae-hyun drives back to Seoul in the calm, focused quiet of someone who just accomplished the first concrete step in a plan with a very long horizon. The B-rank designation comes through 4 days later. Jae-hyun is now the highest registered hunter in Class A, including Seo Aina, who had registered D on entry and has since advanced to C. He is, by registered rank, operating 3 full classifications above most of his cohort after less than a full semester at the academy. The ripple effect this creates in the Class A social ecology is significant, not hostile. Millennium's culture is generally achievement respecting, and the student body takes genuine performance seriously rather than resenting it. But the conversations increase. The attention from instructors changes quality. Professor Yoon's observation sessions during practical training become considerably more focused and considerably less disguised as casual oversight. And Seo Aina looks at him differently. Not obviously. She's not the kind of person who wears her adjustments to perception visibly, but there's something in the way she positions herself during training sessions, slightly more aware of his location, slightly more engaged during any exercise where they're in proximity. He reads it as recalibration. He doesn't initiate any particular conversation about it. When their paths cross in training context, he treats her with the same direct professionalism he always has. She reciprocates in kind. What's building between them as a dynamic is something closer to mutual respect than friendship, and for Jae-hyun that's a useful and honest foundation. Kim Yoo-jing's reaction to the B-rank development is predictably, genuinely delighted. She corners him at the vending machine coffee spot with the expression of someone who bet on a horse and watched it clear the final fence by 6 lengths. "I knew it," she says, with no preamble and enormous conviction. "I told Dabin. I told Seojin. I said, that guy is going to blow past the ranking system before winter break, and nobody believed me." To be fair, Jae-hyun says, the pace was faster than I expected. No, it wasn't. He takes a sip of the terrible coffee. She's not wrong. He knew exactly what the pace was going to be. She grins. "You're going to keep going, aren't you? This isn't the ceiling." "No," he says. "It's not." The certainty in his voice does something to her expression, takes the playful energy down a register into something more genuine. She's looking at him the way she sometimes does, with the specific attention of someone who is tracking something they haven't fully identified yet. "Where are you going?" she asks. "Not geographically. Not in the registered rank sense. She means something broader." Jae-hyun looks at the vending machine for a moment, considers the question. Then, because it's Eugene and she deserves something honest, somewhere that matters, she nods slowly, like that's an answer that makes complete sense, like she suspected as much all along. Mid-semester brings the Academy's first major interclass evaluation, a structured event where students from multiple years compete in coordinated dungeon runs graded on efficiency, teamwork, and overall performance metric. It's partially competitive, partially pedagogical, and mostly an opportunity for the faculty to get a broad view picture of where each cohort is across the full spectrum of the student body. First years are grouped with second years for the event, which means Class A is paired with second-year teams for the first time in a formal evaluation context. Jae-yoon's team assignment places him with Kim Eugene and An Ho-yeon from his own year, and two second-year students he hasn't previously had extended interaction with, Park Jae-eun, a B-rank healer with an excellent reputation within the second-year cohort, and a student named Won Tae-young whose aggressive combat style has apparently produced some memorable field exercise moments in his first year. The dungeon assigned for the group evaluation is a C-rank dimensional space, specifically, a classified fracture zone, which is a dungeon type that emerged relatively recently in the Cataclysm timeline and has unusual spatial properties. In a fracture zone, the dungeon's internal geometry shifts at irregular intervals, which means navigation relies on real-time environmental reading rather than pre-mapped routes. Fracture zones are not usually assigned to first-semester evaluation. They're on the curriculum for second-year advanced practical modules. The fact that this group got one suggests the assignment isn't random. Someone on the faculty side decided this particular combination of students needed a harder problem to look at. Jae-yoon notes this without expressing any particular reaction about it. The fracture zone is disorienting even for someone who knows it's coming. The spatial shifts happen without warning. A corridor that was straight becomes bent. A room that had one exit suddenly has three. Distances that look consistent shift between visual frames without any transitional logic. It creates a kind of vertigo that isn't entirely physical but affects motor coordination enough to matter in combat. Jae-yoon handles the orientation challenge through the same mana sensing technique he's been developing, reading the mana field density rather than relying on spatial perception, which the fracture zone disrupts. He can feel the shape of the dungeon in the mana flow even when the physical geometry has shifted, which gives him a navigation advantage that the rest of the group doesn't have. He shares the information, not the method, just the output. Left branch closes in approximately 30 seconds. Take the right. And consistently, he's correct, which the group notes without pushing for an explanation because in a fracture zone, reliable navigation is a resource you don't interrogate. The team combat is where the group's chemistry has to either produce or fail. Won Tae-young is aggressive in the way the second-year reputation suggested, effective, but with the specific edge of someone whose confidence in their own capability hasn't yet fully incorporated the importance of coordination. Jae-yoon manages him by giving him clear roles that play to his strengths while structuring the approach so that his forward aggression serves the group's tactical position rather than creating coverage gaps for everyone else. Eugene handles area support flawlessly. She and Dabin have clearly been working on coordination. Park Jae-eun's healing creates a safety margin that changes the group's combat approach. With reliable recovery available, the forward elements can push harder, and Jae-yoon adjusts the tactics to take advantage of that margin. An Ho-yeon, quiet and focused as always, covers the angles that everyone else's role leaves exposed. Jae-yoon notices, not for the first time, that Ho-yeon's situational awareness is significantly higher than the first-year benchmark would predict. He's been underperforming relative to his actual capability in a way that's familiar. He files that away for later. The group clears the fracture zone in 1 hour and 7 minutes, which is a strong result for a multi-year group on their first run through this dungeon type. The faculty observer notes the tactical cohesion as exceptional for a mixed-year group. The evaluation results are published 3 days later. Jae-yoon's group placed first among the mixed-year teams, which is the kind of outcome that generates the specific type of faculty attention that comes with implications. But the more immediate consequence is that An Ho-yeon finally says something directly to Jae-yoon. They're back in the dorm room, late evening. Jae-yoon is reviewing the Mythic system interface. Ho-yeon is at his desk with his own materials, and there's a pause in his usual focused rhythm, a moment where he stops working and looks over at his roommate with an expression that is, for the first time, genuinely unguarded. You cover for people, Ho-yeon says, in the way you structure tactics. You figure out what each person can do and then build around them so they perform better than they would on their own. And then nothing about the outcome makes it look like you were responsible for it. Jae-yoon puts down his interface. That's how good tactics work. That's how you choose to do it. Ho-yeon is quiet for a moment. Why? It's a more direct question than Ho-yeon usually produces, and Jae-yoon takes it seriously. Partly because it's more effective. The group performs better when everyone is contributing optimally. A pause. Partly because I have reasons for not being the most visible person in the room right now. Hoyeon takes this in without immediate response. Then, you're operating at a higher level than your record shows. Jaehyun doesn't deny it. Does anyone else know? Professor Yoon has accurate suspicions. Eugene has accurate suspicions. CEO Ina has. He considers this something close to accurate suspicions. Hoyeon nods slowly. I'm not going to say anything. Jaehyun looks at his roommate. At the particular quality of the expression, not curiosity, not suspicion, just a recognition that maps onto a set of reasons he doesn't need to ask about right now. Are you doing the same thing? Jaehyun asks. A pause. Then Hoyeon's mouth curves in something that isn't quite a smile but has the shape of one. I have reasons, he says, which is the closest thing to confirmation he apparently needs to offer right now. They return to their respective work. The room is quiet, but something in the air has shifted. A small honest disclosure, mutually made, that changes the texture of the space between them without requiring any further elaboration. Hila contacts him 2 nights after the evaluation result, which is slightly more promptly than usual, with information about the second frost seal component. It's in a dungeon that Jaehyun knows, not because of the regression, because it's in the Cataclysm incident records from the original timeline. The Serpent's Hall is an A- rank gate that destabilized catastrophically in the original timeline 14 months from now, taking 12 hunters with it, including 2 high-ranked professionals who were inside at the time of the collapse. It's the kind of disaster that has a specific name attached to it in the hunter community. He's going to need to get the second frost seal component out of there before the destabilization happens, and he's going to need to be significantly stronger than he currently is to do it, not because of the component's location, but because the dungeon is A rank and he's currently registered at B, which means the gap between his registration and the dungeon's classification is back to 2 full tiers, and the Serpent's Hall is not a Vortex ruin situation where careful preparation compensates for a classification gap. He needs to be genuinely A rank capable, not just paper registered at B with a capability advantage over the benchmark. Actually A rank capable, for real, in a way that the Serpent's Hall won't contradict with unfriendly consequences. He has 14 months to get there. He opens a new page in his physical notebook and starts writing. The end of first semester brings an academy-wide formal assessment, every student evaluated on the full year's curriculum in both theory and practical context. It's the closest thing Millennium has to a comprehensive grade card, and its results are taken seriously at every level of the institution. Jaehyun's result, when they come in, are the single most discussed outcome of the assessment period. Theory, first in class A not by a small margin. Practical, first in class A by a significant margin. Overall, top of the entire first-year cohort, across all class designations, and he's B rank, clearing a practical assessment benchmark that most B rank students at Millennium have been training toward for 3 years to reach. Professor Yoon calls him into her office again. This time she doesn't have the folder open on the desk and she doesn't start with a question. She just looks at him for a moment, as if she's deciding where to begin. I've been teaching here for 11 years, she says. I can count on one hand the number of students who would be sitting where you're sitting with the numbers you produced in their first semester. Jaehyun wait. The names on that list include the hunter who's currently ranked 3rd in the national standings and the woman who led the field mission that stabilized the Gwinnett Gate collapse last year. She looks at him steadily. You understand what I'm saying? I think so. I'm going to recommend you for accelerated curriculum inclusion. The advanced second-year practical track is more appropriate for your current development stage than the standard first-year continuation. A pause. This will bring you into regular training contact with older students, including some who will be more accurate competition than your current class cohort. Jaehyun thinks about who he's likely to encounter in the second-year advanced track, about who is currently in their second year at Millennium. His older brother, specifically, who is in his second year and has been placed on the advanced practical track since his first semester. I understand, he says. Good. She closes the folder that she apparently opened before he came in and then didn't reference. Old habit. Go have a break, Jaehyun. First semester just ended. You can stop running at this pace for at least a few days. He's not sure that's accurate advice given the timeline he's working against, but he nods politely and leaves. Winter break at the academy is 10 days. Jaehyun uses approximately 2 of them for actual rest, the kind of rest that means not actively training, letting the accumulated physical demands of a very intense semester dissipate, sleeping a full 8 hours because his body has been operating on 6 for months. He spends the other 8 days in a different kind of work. The second frost seal component is inaccessible right now, classified above his current capability regardless of what he plans. What he can do in the break period is address the mythic system side of things, specifically Specifically, the first component, which Hila has been indicating has an activation potential that requires a specific ritual context he hasn't yet had access to. She walks him through it during a late-night session on the third day of break. The ritual is not dramatic. It doesn't involve chanting or circles or any of the theatrical elements that fiction has long associated with summoning divine power. It's more of an interface, a process of consciously aligning the holder's mana signature with the component's inherent frequency until the piece of the artifact recognizes the holder as its carrier and binds. The binding process, once initiated, is uncomfortable. Not painfully so, but in the way that physical adaptation is uncomfortable. The mana system integrating something new, establishing pathways that didn't exist before, finding a steady state with an addition that is dimensionally larger than what went before it. When it settles, Jae-hyun looks at his hands in the dark and feels the difference. Not visually, nothing visible has changed, but there's a quality to his mana flow that wasn't there before. Something cooler, something that has a presence to it that goes beyond his own baseline. Hila says nothing. She doesn't need to. The sensation speaks for itself. Is this going to get significantly more intense when I have all three components? He asks. Yes, she says, with the specific lack of additional information that he has come to accept as her default answer to questions about scale. He nods to himself in the dark of his dorm room. Good. Second semester begins with a rearrangement in Jae-hyun's daily structure. The accelerated curriculum placement means he now attends the advanced practical sessions alongside a cohort of second and third year students, while keeping his first year theory classes for the academic curriculum requirement. It creates an interesting split, 2 hours a day in rooms full of people who are, in terms of calendar experience, 2 to 3 years ahead of him. The advanced practical cohort's response to a first year appearing in their sessions is the kind of response that any tightly knit group produces when its established membership arrangement suddenly includes an unexpected new entry. Not hostile, just watchful. There's a period of assessment that everyone in the room is running simultaneously, measuring the newcomer against the baseline expectations that the existing cohort has for what belongs in this space. Jae-hyun stands the assessment by doing exactly what he always does, performing at a level that is clearly appropriate for the space without announcing anything about the full scope of what he's working with. His brother is in the advanced practical cohort. Of course he is. Their first session in the same practical exercise is a weapons drill, precision mana weapon technique under timed conditions, a fundamental exercise that nonetheless reveals a great deal about the quality of a hunter's foundational training. Seong-oh performs with the smooth, practiced excellence that Jae-hyun has always associated with his brother's work. The older Min is genuinely good. In the first timeline, Jae-hyun spent years holding his brother up as the ceiling to reach, the measure of what the Min family's hunter potential looked like at full expression. Watching him now, from this side of the regression and the Hila contract and the C-rank assessment and everything since, Jae-hyun can measure the gap accurately for the first time. Seong-oh is B-rank level, pressing toward a strong, technically refined, with the kind of combat experience that produces a fluency in application that raw talent alone doesn't generate. The gap between them is smaller than his brother expected, considerably smaller. When the session ends and the cohort disperses, Seong-oh falls into step beside Jae-hyun in the corridor with the casual ease of a person who has been waiting for the natural opportunity to do exactly this. You're good, Seong-oh says, the same tone as the cafeteria lunch, genuine, with the strategic interest underneath. You're better than I remember, Jae-hyun says. His brother looks at him sideways. You remember training with me? I've watched you spar. In the first year. A pause. You never came to watch before. I came to watch plenty, Jae-hyun says. You just didn't notice. Seong-oh is quiet for a moment, processing this new information with the recalibrating expression that Jae-hyun is starting to recognize as his brother's version of genuine surprise. When did you get competitive about this? Jae-hyun glances at him. I was always competitive about this. I just wasn't good enough to show it. Something shifts in his brother's expression, not dramatically, but in the specific way of someone who just had a long-standing assumption revised. A small silence falls between them, less comfortable than the ones from the cafeteria lunch but more honest. I'd like to spar, Seong-oh says. When you're ready, I'll let you know, Jae-hyun says. He means it. He will let him know. Just not yet. The second semester brings the Academy's midpoint examination series, which is structured as a realistic field operation rather than a controlled evaluation setting. Groups assigned to actual active dungeon gate, given clearance objectives, and assessed on both individual performance and collective outcomes. It's the most demanding evaluation of the first year. Jae-hyun's assigned team is a mixed-year group again, but the composition is different this time. The practical cohort arrangement means he's grouped with second and third year members rather than exclusively first years. Co Ina, who the faculty has placed in the mixed group, apparently apparently because the standard first-year assessment isn't providing accurate data on her ceiling. 1 Taeyong again, and 2 third years whose names he knows from reputation as upper-end performers. The dungeon is a B-rank forest cathedral, an unusual category, forest environment with architecture integrated into the natural growth, giving it a strangeness that purely dungeon-designed environments don't have. The monster population is mixed type, the boss is a B-rank divine attribute construct, and there's an environmental complication. The cathedral's growth patterns generate mana interference fields that affect targeting and sensory abilities intermittently. It's a good test. The kind of dungeon where the weakest link in a group determines the outcome more than the strongest link enhances it. What happens inside the forest cathedral is something that Jae-hyun looks back on later as the session where the concealment strategy stops being fully viable, not because he chooses to drop it, because the situation makes it necessary, briefly, to be more than what the concealment allows. The third-year students are capable. The run goes well for the first 3 chambers. It's in the 4th chamber that the encounter exceeds the group's collective threat assessment, a mob wave that's operating above the expected density and aggression level for this dungeon's classification, which occasionally happens when a dungeon cycles through a peak period. The 2 third-year students are handling the front engagement. 1 Taeyong is covering left flank, Seo Aina is at mid-range managing area suppression, and Jae-hyun is covering right flank and calling tactical adjustment. One of the third-year students goes down, not dead, critically wounded, out of combat, requiring immediate positioning to prevent follow-on damage. The remaining third year is managing 2 high-tier mobs simultaneously while 1 Taeyong, without the support of the first third year, starts to get pressured on the left. The tactical situation deteriorates in about 4 seconds. Jae-hyun does the math, available resources, current threats, gap coverage requirements, and the math says that maintaining calibrated output isn't compatible with everyone coming out of this chamber healthy. He stops calibrating. Not entirely. He doesn't activate anything that would require an explanation he's currently not ready to give, but the step up from carefully managed B-rank output to his actual operational level is something that the people in the room with him notice. It's in the quality of the movement, too precise, too fast, too economical in the way that high-level hunters move when they're not thinking about how they look. It's in the way 2 of the high-priority threats in the chamber are managed simultaneously with a mana-enhanced weapon technique that is, objectively, not what a B-rank registration number produces. The situation stabilizes. The wounded third year is protected. 1 Taeyong recovers his position. The mob wave clears, and Seo Aina, from her mid-range position, has been watching the entire thing. Her expression is exactly what Jae-hyun would have predicted if he'd thought about it, not shocked, not confused, but settled into the specific clarity of someone who just saw the answer to a question they've been carrying around for several months. She doesn't say anything. Not in the chamber, not in the debrief, not in the transit back to the academy. Later, at the door of the dorm building, she stops him. "How long have you been managing what I see from what you actually are?" she asks. He considers the option. Denial is off the table. Partial truth is probably the most he can offer, since before the entrance exam. A pause. Something in her expression that takes a moment to read. It's not anger about the concealment. It's something more like respect, which is either a good sign or a very complicated one. "Are you going to keep doing it?" "For now, yes." She looks at him for a long moment with those sharp, precise eyes that miss very little. "Then, I'll keep it." She walks inside. He stands in the courtyard for a moment. The full weight of what that conversation represents landing without ceremony. Seo Aina knows. She knows, and she's chosen not to push, which means she's made a determination about whether his reasons are ones she's willing to accommodate. That is, he thinks, a significant trust to extend. He intends to be worth it. 2 weeks before the end of second semester's formal midpoint period, something happens that wasn't in the original timeline. Min Seong-oh does not behave in year 2 of the original timeline the way he is behaving in this revision. In the original, Jae-hyun didn't exist in Seong-oh's daily orbit until the 3rd year. There wasn't the constant contact, the shared practical sessions, the accumulating small interactions that a revised timeline produces when 2 people are in the same institution at the same time. The original timeline's dynamics between the brothers were shaped by distance and intermittent encounter. This one is shaped by proximity. And proximity, Jae-hyun is discovering, is doing things to the pattern he expected his brother to follow. The event that marks the change is something he had no reason to anticipate, a situation that didn't exist in the original timeline because the condition that generated it didn't exist. A dungeon breach event. Controlled scale, within the academy zone, but genuine, a destabilizing gate in the training district that produces a monster spillover before the containment response fully arrives. Jae-hyun is there. He's coming back from the training facility when it happens, which means he's in the breach zone before any official response personnel arrive. The monsters that have spilled out are B rank, above what the standard civilian area is equipped to handle and above what the responding first-year students who are scattered around the area can comfortably manage. planet. Seong-oh is there too. Same situation, wrong place, right time, or wrong time depending on how you look at it. The breach response isn't a coordinated dungeon run. It's a reactive situation where two people who are both good at what they do have to operate in a non-ideal environment with imperfect information and no established tactical framework. Jae-hyun handles two of the spilled B-rank monsters with the efficiency that the situation requires and that his actual capability allows, not fully unconcerned with concealment, but genuinely unable to prioritize it when there are students and bystanders in the area who will be harmed if he doesn't move quickly. Seong-oh handles the other two with the kind of clean competence that Jae-hyun has always known his brother was capable of. And at some point during the response, when the immediate threat is neutralized and the containment teams are arriving to close the gate, the two brothers are standing next to each other in the aftermath of something that didn't go wrong because they were both capable enough to prevent it. Seong-oh looks at him. Really looks at him, not the assessing, measured look from the cafeteria, not the calculating awareness from the hallway. Something more direct than either of those. The way you look at someone when the performance has dropped because the situation didn't allow for it. You're not B-ranked, Seong-oh says. Jae-hyun takes a breath. No, what are you? The honest answer would be, I'm not fully sure yet, but hell, his contract is changing what the answer is every month, and I have a mythic item component bound to my mana flow and a plan that extends 2 years into a future I've already lived, and I'm afraid of what you're going to do in 18 months and I don't know how to tell you any of that. What he says is stronger than I've been showing. Seong-oh is quiet for a long moment. Around them, the containment response is doing its job. Professionals securing the breach perimeter, assessment staff documenting the response. In the middle of all that activity, the two brothers stand in a quiet pocket of stillness. Why are you hiding it? Seong-oh asks, and his voice, for the first time in the conversation, sounds less like a tactical inquiry and more like something personal. Jae-hyun looks at his brother, at the version of him that exists right now, before the event, before the choice, before the thing that in the first timeline made the older Min into a different category of person in Jae-hyun's life. Because I'm not ready for what comes next if I stop, he says. Seong-oh processes this. Next being what? Jae-hyun meets his eyes. I'm still working that out. It's not a satisfying answer. He knows it's not. Seong-oh knows it's not, and the expression on his brother's face reflects that. The specific frustration of someone who suspects the complete picture is more significant than the partial one they're being given, and who cares enough about the person withholding it to be genuinely bothered rather than simply strategically interested. You can tell me things, Seong-oh says quietly. Whatever you think you're protecting yourself from, you can tell me. Jae-hyun is not prepared for how much that costs him to hear. Not in a breaking down way. More like standing in a wind that's stronger than expected and having to work to stay where you are. I know, he says, and means it, and also knows, with the full weight of what he carries from a future, that this version of his brother still has the opportunity not to arrive at. That trusting too early is a mistake he cannot make. Not yet, but I know. They're separated by the arrival of the Academy's emergency response faculty who need to debrief everyone in the vicinity. The moment ends. Jae-hyun goes through the debrief with the appropriate detail level, confirms his involvement in the breach response, and walks back to his dormitory with a mental state that is considerably more complicated than his usual precise, organized interior. Hila is quiet for the entire walk back. She respects the space for it, which is, he thinks, one of the more unexpected qualities she has demonstrated in the months since the contract was established. He reaches the dormitory, opens the door, exchanges a nod with An Hoyeon, who is already back at his desk and apparently not going to ask about the breach response unless Jae-hyun brings it up himself, and sits on the edge of his bed in the late evening quiet of a semester that has been longer and more consequential than anything in the first timeline that preceded it. He picks up his physical notebook and opens it to the current page. The list that started 2 months ago, the step-by-step plan written in the careful handwriting of someone who was determined not to waste the second chance he'd been given. The list is longer now. More items checked. More items added, because the plan is living and the situation evolves and the original architecture gets refined by the reality of actually executing it. The frost seal first component, bound. The second component, in the Serpent's Hall, inaccessible for now but map planned for, given a deadline that he intends to beat by a significant margin. His registration at B rank, with the actual capability sitting considerably above that and climbing. His position at Millennium, better than expected, more complicated than planned, but genuinely useful in ways that the tactical overview didn't fully anticipate. The relationships that are forming, Yujing, Hoyeon, Seo Aina, the complicated ongoing question of Seong-oh, each one a variable that the original plan treated as background and that the actual execution has revealed as foreground. And somewhere above all of it, the larger picture that Hila still isn't fully sharing. The complete scope of what the mythic items are for. The actual structure of the threat that's coming. He knows pieces of it from the first timeline. The major gate collapses, the disaster events, the cascade cascade failures that the hunter community tried to manage reactively because nobody had the foreknowledge to manage them proactively. He lived through the end of that timeline and it wasn't good, in the diffuse, grinding, nobody wins way that real-world failures tend to be. He has the chance to change the shape of what's coming, not just for himself, for the people around him, for the students who in the original timeline walked into the Serpent's Hall collapse and didn't walk out, for the hunters who were lost to the gate failures because the response capacity that should have been built wasn't built in time. The notebook sits open in his hands. The list is concrete and grounded and honest about how much work is left. He's not afraid of the work. He never has been. What he is, sitting in the quiet of his dorm room with a mythic item component humming faintly in his mana flow and a contract with a Norse goddess operating in the background of everything he does, is determined. More specifically, he is the determined version of a person who died once, took the regression, and has absolute clarity about the fact that the world is going to give him exactly one more shot to get this right. He's not going to waste it. He caps the pen, closes the notebook, and goes to sleep. End of part 1, chapters 1 to 25. Outro note, and that is where we leave Min Jae-hyun at the end of chapters 1 through 25. B rank registered, a rank capable and climbing. One mythic item component bound to his mana structure. A divine contract with Gila operating quietly in the background. A spot in Millennium's advanced practical curriculum. A growing set of people who see varying amounts of who he actually is and have each, in their own way, decided they're not going anywhere. And 14 months on the clock before the Serpent's Hall destabilizes and takes 12 hunters with it, unless someone changes the timeline by being in that dungeon first. The setup for everything that comes after is all in place. The mythic system, the Gila contract, the academy structure, the relationships, the escalating confrontation with the timeline he already knows is coming. Jae-hyun has been laying groundwork with the patience of someone who understands that the foundation matters as much as anything that gets built on top of it. The next arc is where the foundation gets tested. The question of Min Seong-oh, what his older brother actually becomes in this revised timeline, and whether the event that defined their relationship in the original still arrives on the same schedule, is sitting unresolved in a way that is going to demand resolution. The A-rank assessment is next. The Serpent's Hall is next. And somewhere in the Gila contract's fuller picture, a threat that Jae-hyun has been preparing for without being told the complete scope of it is getting closer. Mythic item obtained is the kind of manhwa that rewards patience. Every chapter is building towards something specific, and the payoffs land harder because the groundwork was laid carefully. The story is just getting started.